This presentation is for the Des Moines Historical Society about Clyde Herring, founder of Herring Motor Company and former governor of Iowa. This presentation is by Victoria Herring, Clyde's granddaughter.
This was actually a very interesting project for me. I am young enough not to remember my grandfather in person, in live body. He died in 1945, not too long after my parents were married, so I wasn't even probably conceived by then. So I really got very interested in looking into some of this history, and I have a lot of the political stuff. But I decided, and I apologize to those of you who are here for the politics, I really was more interested in learning about him up to 32. I mean, there's plenty of stuff on 32 to 45, but finding out information about him in his background and his work here in Des Moines and how he got to be governor. So that's sort of where I went on this, and it was rather interesting. I have a lot of old family pictures. I also found things. Google is a great resource if you put a name in. I had to go through 12 or 14 pages before I got to some really good Google book sort of stuff, but it was really very interesting. I found a lot of things that I didn't know existed actually. So anyway, this is him, I assume, in the 20s. He was born in Michigan, actually, in a small town, Leoni Township, which is in Jackson County, which is west of Detroit. He was basically born and raised on a farm. His father was a farmer. I was in Wales a couple years ago to visit my forebears. His parents were children of the people from Wales who came over in 1852. So that was sort of fun for me to sort of see where everyone came from and to see the farming land that they farmed there in Wales too. That was interesting. So anyway, he was born in Michigan, went to school. He never did finish high school. I saw in one of the resources it said he went through 7th or 8th grade, and another it said he finished a year of high school. In any event, he didn't finish high school. I also saw in some references that he did a lot of reading. And the one thing that I can swear to is he was heavy into books, because when we lived here in Des Moines on 44th Street, we had books all over the house, and that's not only because of my parents, but also because he kept buying books. He's got all these books about people I find very boring. Or people I don't even know. And books that really are very old, but that might have some historical value to somebody who's interested in those times. In any event, they moved into Jackson, and Jackson, Michigan is a larger town near Leoni. And he did a bunch of little jobs as a young man in the town of Jackson. And he did some work at a jeweler's shop. And my understanding is he was initially a janitor at the jeweler's shop. And then he got to the point of saying, I can do more than this. And he wanted to learn how to be a jeweler, how to work on watches and clocks and all that, and work on jewels. And so he started to learn, I think, my understanding, again, I'm extrapolating this from the various sources I've read. He started to learn some of that in Jackson at the Case jewelry shop. In the meantime, evidently, the Spanish-American War came along, and he was too young to join, but he talked his parents into letting him join. But by the time they got around to it, smart parents, he had missed all the hostilities, and he only had 3 months, and he was running around carrying rifles, I guess, and that's all he did. He never pretended that he knew anything about it. In the late 90s, he wanted to get a better job, and he read in the newspaper, or in whatever papers there were at the time, that there was a job in Detroit at a jeweler's shop, but the person had to be there at 8 a.m. in the morning. And the quotes that I have in here are from articles where he was interviewed about, as you might imagine, when he was running for political office, people went back and wanted to find out about him. So I got a lot of that information from those interviews. So anyway, he got up early in the morning and rode his bike into Detroit. And he was there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he got the job. And in the family, I've always thought it was Rolshoven Jewelers, and I don't know, and I couldn't get all that research pulled together in times, and the only reason I think that there's a Rolshoven in that jewelry shop is when my grandparents got married, they received a silver set, and it's a very nice old silver set. And then there's a painter called Julius Rolshoven who used to paint Indian pictures. And we have two great, really beautiful oil paintings of Indians in our house that were in my house when I grew up, and where grandfather owned them. So I think that's the connection in the Detroit area. This is actually a picture I found. I didn't know we had this, but he is doing his jewelry work there. He got his job in Detroit, and he was doing jewelry work, and there's obviously as an apprentice, he wouldn't have been able to do anything. He was not, he was very young, probably 18 or 19. He was doing his jewelry work, fixing watches and stuff, under the control of, or not control, but under the auspices of a Maine jeweler who was out one day. And Henry Ford comes in. Now, Henry Ford at that point was also young and hadn't really started to make his way yet. Automobiles were not really a main form of transportation. There are a lot of pictures of people and horses and buggies and everything else prior to the automobile really taking over. So in any event, he fixed Henry's watch. And I guess Henry liked the fact that he fixed his watch because he had him fix another one. And they struck up a friendship. And this was not only something I read in all of these articles and interviews, but my parents also told me that too, that he formed his friendship with Henry Ford back when in Detroit at the jeweler's shop. And then later, as you know, he got into the automobile business. Thank you, Henry Ford. This is interesting, and this is where I'm extrapolating. Back in 1900, Clyde Herring lived on Fort West Street in Detroit. And he was a boarder there, that's where he lived. And in that place, Anson B. Spinney lived. And he was in his 50s or something. And he had a daughter, Emma Pearl Spinney. And Emma Pearl Spinney and Clyde L. Herring got married. Now, I always have thought that it was sort of like Dr. Spinney had his daughter around there. She went to school, I think in some school there too. But she would visit. And so they're sitting on the porch and talking and talking. You know how people fall in love in those days. So anyway, they married each other in 1901, which really was fairly quick after this census. So I think they obviously cared for each other at that point. But no one ever told me how they met, but this is my supposition from reading the census records. So that's the two of them. I don't know necessarily when those pictures are, but they look like they're about that same point in time. Pictures we have in the family don't have identification on them. We have a lot of pictures of people that I don't know. And dates are not present on them either. He started having health issues, and a doctor, sounds like a Teddy Roosevelt story, right? Doctor tells him, you're just working yourself to death, or whatever he tells him, you're not doing very well, you need to go west, young man, for your health. Your health is terrible, and you're not going to survive another few years. So he decided to move west. And fortunately, his wife, her father, Dr. Spinney, had a whole bunch of land in the Park County area in Colorado. And his brother, Benjamin, out there, also had land. So there's a whole Spinney quadrant there in Park County. So Clyde moved out there, and he became postmaster in Spinney, Colorado. That's what this little diagram or chart thing is. It's a part of a form I picked up. And I don't know, I think this may be the Herring Ranch, but I can't swear to you because I can't remember where I got the picture, but it was told to me that it's the Herring Ranch in Colorado. Nothing fancy. He had, I think, 7,000 head or something. And one interview said that he took them on cattle drives in Colorado and New Mexico and that sort of thing. Because he was a farmer, and they did evidently at some point in Michigan have some cattle. I guess that was sort of natural for him to be doing that. When he was there for a while, he's in Colorado, and he decided that he wanted to do something else. He really was tired of cattle ranching. And so what he did was, according to the stuff I'm reading in the various articles, he moved for some reason. I don't know how he picked it, but he moved to Messina in Cass County, Iowa. And initially, he was working in a farm, or he owned a farm, small 1,200 acre farm, outside of Messina in Cass County. The guy got bored farming. And I think my recollection from some of the articles was he wanted to do a feedlot operation because you could bring the cattle in, fatten them up, feed them in Iowa, and then sell them. And then he realized, I also know Henry Ford. And this is the time when the Ford cars are starting to become, now I know nothing about old cars, but A's and T's about that time, I think in the mid 1906, 7, 8, were becoming more popular. And so he wrote to Henry and he said, you know, can I have one of your cars on wholesale? I'd like to have a car out here. And Henry sent him 3, and not with the idea he could have 3. But he sent him the 3, and he kept 1, and he sold the other 2, and he made $300. And he figured, I think, that he was probably a pretty good salesman. So he thought, well, I could be doing this. I could do more of this. And I think he was a lot more fulfilled in that sort of a job where he could organize things and talk to people and sell people and get people to agree with him on purchasing and that sort of thing. So he did have the car dealer business in Atlantic initially. Now this is just a picture of the cattle ranch, Dr. Spinney's Texas Bunch. This is a quote from him again. This is a picture of him about that same point in time. Again, he just wanted to see if Henry would do him a nice gift, and he did, and now here's the Atlantic Automobile Company. That is a building that actually was fixed up toward the time that he moved to Des Moines. So we're getting into Des Moines, folks. Be patient with me. Atlantic Automobile Company was doing actually pretty good business, and in fact, in one of the papers I read, half of the cars registered in Cass County at some point in time were Fords. And since Clyde had the Ford dealership for the general vicinity there, he had sold a lot of Fords. He's doing this Atlantic automobile business, and he builds it up. His brother moves in from Colorado. His father wasn't in Colorado, comes into Messina, and they sort of take over the business of the automobile business in Atlantic. In the meantime, Clyde says, I'm going to the big city. So he comes to Des Moines, which at that point was, of course, a big city. I don't know statistically, but I think maybe 150,000, maybe not that many. Don't quote me on that. And according to some of the information, he evidently lived on Ridge Road, but I don't know the specifics of that. I just read that he had sold that house and bought another. So all the formative years from 1910, 11 to his death, and my father's, grew up there, etc. All those years, they spent at 180 37th Street. And I was in that house once, and if you remember they used to do the Decorator Show House here in Des Moines, and one year they took that house and they did the Decorator Show House then. And so I got contacted and I went and I was able to go through the house, but otherwise I'd never been there. So other than to see it, and actually I did have when I was single, I had an apartment on 37th 38th down the street, and so I went by that house. I've been around it, and I have a picture, which is not in this, of him It's very bizarre. He's got a hat on, he's got a fedora on, he's in his greenhouse, and he's working on his plants. I don't know why you wear a fedora in your greenhouse, but that's what he was doing. And because he had a greenhouse up on the side of the yard, and my recollection from reading again is that Henry Wallace lived fairly close and also planted seeds and tested things out in the herring greenhouse because it was evidently a fairly large structure. These are two other pictures of that 37th Street house, and then him and two boys. They had two girls, and they both died fairly young in '02 and '04 or so. The tall kid here is the older one, Laverne, who I did know because he lived with us. He had developed lung cancer, and he lived in our house while he was moving off this mortal coil. And I do have very, small snippets, but very good memories of him. And I've got some little notes. He used to write little notes, or type little notes to me, actually. And the other is Lawrence. And Lawrence is a guy who had sort of a business job, and he died young. He died, I think, in his late 30s or so. So, but his son, Lawrence, Clyde Lawrence, is still around, and he's in Detroit, actually. This is just a little blurb here that I found, again, in the interviews. He started out the Herring Motor Company in 1910 with just a few employees and not much of an idea other than to sell cars to people. The minimum wage of $5.60 a day at that point in time was more than most people paid for minimum wage. And he paid it to men and women. I got that from some campaign literature that I had from 1920s. So he was at least very progressive at that point in time. And as he points out, every time he raised the wages, the profits went up. So things must be going well. I don't know. That would be really nice if all businesses had that same thing. This is what I found from reading some of the literature on the buildings here in Des Moines. He initially was at 912 to 914 Locust Street, and then he had down 110 Locust Street, and then he decided to build a building, and he bought the land at 10th and Mulberry. And right now, actually, if you go down to 10th and Mulberry, the Herring building is there. This is where I got some of my pictures. And I want to live there, actually, folks. But I can't right now. We can't move. So someday maybe I'll live there. But he built that in 10th and Mulberry. So he was pretty busy down in downtown Des Moines, having a successful business over the years. This tells you a little bit more about the 10th Street. And we were talking just a little on the side here. The building was designed by a reputable architect here in Des Moines, Proudfit, Bird, and Rawson. And I don't know what else they might have designed, but it's a name I'm familiar with. And he built it as a 4-story building in 1912. And then they needed 2 more, so they built 2 more floors on top of the building, which I guess I never think about the fact that you could do that. This Herring Motor Company sign is on the outside of the building downtown, so if you want to go see it, it's down there on the building. And they've really renovated the building very well. It looks to me the same as what I've seen in the pictures. These are old snaps from some article about the creation of the Herring Motor Company. And if you look at these pictures, I guess I see 4 stories. So this is before the last 2 stories were put on top. And you can see the cars there. Again, not my area of expertise. And here is a picture more later on that I found. The people who, by the way, the people who have fixed up the Herring Motor Company building at, not the Look building. Look building is a separate building, we'll talk about that. But they have fixed it up, but what they did, they have a website, and it's called Your Apartment in Downtown Des Moines, I think, or Your Apartment in Des Moines. I can't remember right now. I will find it if you need it. And it tells you the history of the building, and a lot of these pictures are from that. He did very well as a Ford dealer, and Henry Ford came out in 1916 and visited. I've got a picture here of him, but that's because he was selling so many cars and doing so much as a Ford dealer here in Des Moines. One of the documents I found was an article he had written, or an interview he had given, one or the others, where he was explaining how important it was in business to be a businessman. If you're going to be the businessman, you be the president, and other people, you tell them what to do and how to do it. You don't try to do their job. You hire people so because they know something. They know what to do, and they will do their job well, and you'll do fine running that business. And that service was the most important thing to them. And by the time I think that interview was held, he was doing a lot of support of other dealers around the state. It's too complicated, but basically Ford changed how they did everything in the late 20s. But at the time he was making his money and doing his business in the early 20s and mid 20s, that is when he was doing a lot of support services for other Ford dealers throughout the state. Those of you who know, and all of you probably do, that at 18th and Grand Tech High School, Central Academy, used to be Solar Aircraft. My mother worked at Solar Aircraft during the war. So I have a great feeling for that building. And before that, it was a Herring Motor Company plant. And they would bring in the parts for the cars on the railroad. You know, the railroad tracks are right there. And they'd take them off, they'd put them in the building, and they'd assemble those cars. And that was what was really how it was done in those days. Somewhere I read that they assembled 200 cars a day. World War I came around, and he had, you know, a business flourishing. He did sign up for the draft, of course. You had to, I think, at that point in time. Again, I don't have knowledge of that, but he did do the draft registration in 1918. And then he got involved in the Liberty Loan sales. And that is where we were raising money to support troops and food and other things that were involved in the war. And so this one is he bought for his son. I think this is Laverne's or Lawrence's. He's got one. I've got 4 of them, his and Dad's and Pearl's, I guess, and they each bought $50 or $1, whatever it is, Liberty Loan. At that time, that's real money, by the way. You know, it doesn't seem like much now. There's a picture of Henry Ford visiting Des Moines. He visited Des Moines in 1916. There's another picture or a story I read that he visited with Thomas Edison and Firestone, and that evidently Edison and Firestone also had plants here at some point in there. So again, this is not something I was able to research, but I thought it was interesting. I did see that story. The other thing I learned as a result of this was that they had a baseball team. Now, nothing, you know, not a great baseball team. The only story I saw, they lost badly. But they did have a baseball team as one of those minor league teams. And down below is a picture that I took of a map we have, the Hermelin oil map, which is all of the railroads and the roads in Iowa. So he was involved in a whole bunch of business dealings here in Des Moines, and also was involved in civic activity. The Greater Des Moines Committee is, I think, the Chamber of Commerce in those days, I'm pretty sure. Liberty Loan, of course. He and Hubble and one other name got together and built the Fort Des Moines Hotel. He evidently, with Hubble and this other gentleman, raised $2 million and built the grandest hotel west of the Mississippi, according to the article I saw. So I found that was really interesting. It's a great hotel, and apparently it's in the works to come back. And I'm just looking forward to going and seeing it. I gather they're fixing it up, and they're going to retain a lot of the old historical qualities of it, but have it modern, updated. He was in the commercial club in Hyperion. In 1911, this article is about him. He was a Republican. Now, he was a Republican in Michigan. He was a Republican throughout his life, apparently, until later, when he smartly became a Democrat. Back in 1920, he had, according to one of the stories, Henry Ford told him he ought to run for public office. And so in 1920, he ran for governor, and he lost. This letter, you probably can't read it from there, but this is one of those letters that I found in the paperwork on his campaign that year. It's a letter telling this friend to go out and get registered, because you can't vote if you don't register. So you have to register. I think I'm going to send that. Everyone should remember that, because it's true today too, obviously. So he ran, he lost. I don't know the specifics of that campaign. It's either then or it's in 1922. One of those campaigns, he spent about $3,700 to win. Of course, to lose, actually. He spent it to win, but he did lose, so he spent his own money on that. He ran in 1922. He didn't run. What happened was the senator, I think, left office or died or something, and there was a special election held in 1922, and he ran against Smith Brookhart, and he lost that race too. And they were pretty, they weren't small losses. They were 58 to 32% or something like that. It wasn't like he was eking things out, but that was just the way it was. He did do that, run in those two races. But having done that, he figured he'd done all he needed to do, in politics at least. And he was basically a businessman. And as I said, his writings reflect his business acumen and decisions to make things very organized. So he returned to the Herring Motor Company. And again, we're in the 20s, so it's before the Depression, folks. He's still doing well. Well, he lost everything in the Depression. They repossessed his home. The bank allowed him to rent it for $125 a month, but he didn't own it for a while until he paid off whatever he had to pay off, I guess, and then he was able to get the house back. He did own a lot of real estate, apartments and oil buildings, I guess, of some type here in Des Moines. Lost all that. No one could pay their rent, so he couldn't pay the mortgages on them, so he lost all that. So he started out with $2 to $3 million at the highest point in the 20s, mid-20s probably, which is worth a lot of money. I'd be glad to have that. A friend of mine 20 years ago was talking to me because he had a friend who knew grandfather, and he said that they were sitting around, this other friend and grandfather and a bunch of other guys were sitting around this table, and they're all talking about, what are we going to do? Somebody's got to run for governor, and it pays. It's a paying job, folks. And so he said, oh, heck, I'll run. No problem. I'll just run. I've done it before. I can do it again. So he decided to run in 1932 for governor as a Democrat. And as you all know, Franklin Roosevelt did rather well in 1932 and swept in. He had coattails, and he swept in a lot of Democrats, including my grandfather. And ironically, my husband's father was running for county treasurer in Fort Dodge in Webster County, and he's got swept in. So we have this ad that says, Franklin Roosevelt is here, and Clyde Herring is here, and Elmo McCormick is here, and a whole bunch of other people. And I just find that terribly ironic that, Mark's dad was on the same ticket, I guess, as my grandfather. It's not how we met, but that's a nice thing to add to it. He ended up serving in Washington, D.C. As senator, and then he lost in 42, and Roosevelt put him into the OPA, the Office of Price Administration, after the war. As it was winding down, they wanted to control prices and protect consumers and stop people from making money off of the inflation, et cetera. This is a quote I found because I was looking for a good quote to end on, and I'm not going to end, but this one I thought was interesting because it tells me he saw himself as a servant of the people who elected him into office. He wasn't in charge of them. He was in charge of pulling things together and doing things for them. But once he gets turned out, he's ready to leave. He'll go back to whatever he wants to or has to do. In 1932, he became governor, and his main job that next 4 years was to help Iowa get out of the Depression. And you know about the farm foreclosure and the bank holiday issues and putting roads out in the state so that we don't have to go through the mud anymore. There's a lot of those stories that I just generally know about and I could talk about later sometime. One thing that I did find that was really interesting, and I didn't bring the original because it's special to me. This is a letter that he wrote in 1920 to Pearl from Henry Ford's house. He and Henry and everyone, he was out there on some sort of a, Ford dealer business trip. He'd take the train in and all. And so he was there, and they decide it's a nice day, it's winter time, they're gonna go ice skating. That's the days people ice skated a lot. So they all go out and ice skate, and he gets his skate caught in a crack. And he falls over, and he really wrecks his leg. And so Henry Ford takes him into his house, and they took care of him for 2 weeks. The doctor wouldn't let him move, and Mrs. Ford was being nice to him, and Henry was being nice to him, and so he was being taken care of by Henry Ford and his wife in their house in Detroit, Michigan, because of his bad leg, which I find a really rather interesting story. And finding the letter was really special too. That was really fun to see him explain it all in this very long letter, which of course no one does letters anymore nowadays, so we won't have these things anymore. He was also involved in the very first aviation place here in Des Moines on Merle Hay and Merle Hay wouldn't have been called that then, but Merle Hay and Douglas. They had a very first aviation installation. He evidently was one of the persons who put that together too. So, and he did a lot of flying. The other thing I found interesting, I hate to fly. He flew all the time. We're in, the 30s and 40s, all the time, back and forth from DC to Des Moines. So, he evidently had no trouble with it. I think what I'd like to do is have questions or have thoughts about other things that you find interesting.
You know if he had anything to do with Des Moines Ford tractor plant?
There was I don't know, but I remember reading somewhere there were Fordson tractors, what they used to be called, and he did sell those, I gather, and he was involved in that. And one of those many stories I was reading, they did talk about that. The question there was about the Fordson tractor, and yes, he had some involvement in that.
My grandfather was from Atlantic, and he was an acquaintance of Clyde. I don't think they were best buddies or anything, but he lived at 61st and Douglas.
Out here, yeah.
Over there. And he always mentioned Clyde Herring and saying he had an airport, and you just confirmed that over on Merle Hay and Douglas.
Yeah.
And so I really kind of came here to kind of confirm that what my
confirm what your grandfather was telling you.
Really right, and I had no reason to doubt him, but it's
right.
It's nice that you confirmed that.
It was a story I didn't even know. No one had ever told me at all about his involvement in that early
When was Clyde Herring born?
1879.
Okay, my grandfather was born in 1890.
Okay,
so he would have been 10 years his senior.
Right.
But close to the same.
Yeah, Jerry?
So he was definitely interested in aviation. Is there a connection between that and then Solar Air Plant taking over that building?
I don't believe so, honestly. That was pretty much, unless he did a deal in DC, because they came in when the war was starting up and they had to tool things up. Again, I haven't researched the Solar Aircraft Plant, but I do know the Herring assembly plant closed down and Solar took it over. That's all I know. Yeah.
What corner, was it northwest on Merle Hay and Douglas?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay,
The monastery
Or
there.
northeast.
okay. The gentlemen are conferring and explaining that the aviation field was at the northeast corner of Merle Hay and Douglas.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, blocks and blocks of that area are now platted as aviation.
Oh, okay. The name of the plat, okay. That's great.
But he is said to be the first man to use an airplane while campaigning.
That's possible because,
And there were a lot of Model A's. There were Ford Model A airplanes, and I think that may have been partly due to him that he used the Ford motors in his aircraft. But he was quite well known as experimental aircraft.
Linda was just explaining to us that he had a interest in using aviation and planes during his campaigning, and that might have something to do with using the Ford motors in those planes. I think that's another research point. I'll have to go out and look. I'll have to talk to you.
I've always
Okay.
wanted to call Victoria on the telephone to tell her these two stories, but I was afraid I'd
Oh, I'm sorry, this is Jerry Jewett.
get a bill. You know how attorneys are.
You're still going to get a bill.
My grandparents built one of the first houses on 37th Street, and Gardner Cole Sr. owned all the property from John Lynn to Grand Avenue and from 37th Street way over to 38th Street Place in Tonawanda. And my grandmother was a sister to Mrs. Gardner Coles. And they always wanted to live close to each other. So my grandfather built a house just before Gardner Coles built his house. My grandparents' property went all the way over to 38th Street Place, and the backyard was my mother's pony pasture. And as a wedding present, my grandparents gave my folks the pony pasture. In 1923, they gave it to them as a wedding present. In 1923, my folks built a house on the property. And her father loved to play around that house. And one day he disappeared. And they looked all over for him, and he found him over at the house. He'd fallen down the chimney, and they couldn't get him out. And they had just laid that chimney up out of brick that day, and they had to take the whole chimney down to get his father out.
I'm glad they did.
One more story. I used to sit on her grandfather's lap when I was 4 years old, and he'd be having dinner, and the butler would come around serving the food, and the butler, did you ever hear Mackie?
Oh yeah, I know Mac.
Did you? Well, Mackie was just a great man. A black gentleman, and he had a daughter just my age, so I played with her a lot. But anyway, I was sitting on her grandfather's lap, and at the end of his dinner, he always gave me 2 cigars to take home to my grandfather.
Oh, okay.
And I'd get my tricycle and ride up to a certain place in the bushes and pull into the bushes. And I always carried matches, so I'd smoke one cigar and take the other cigar to my grandfather. I could tell you all kinds of stories,
Yeah.
but I don't want to talk.
I'm going to have to. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
Do I recall that you have your grandfather's desk?
Oh, yes. Thank you, artist. Okay. In our house in Des Moines, and then when we moved to D.C., my dad had it in his office. I have this lovely, I think it's lovely, it's a lovely desk. It's a copy of George Washington's desk made by Kittinger or someone. So it's a fancy, gorgeous desk. It's got doors that come out on each side. And it's just gorgeous. It has a little sides on the left and the right where you can put papers, and my husband now uses it, and he's got papers, and the drawers are filled with stuff. But it's a really gorgeous desk, and it was grandfather's probably in the Ford company, and then also he took it to the governor's office too, I think. It's a gorgeous desk. Yeah.
Do you know if they moved to the governor's mansion, or was there a governor's mansion at that time?
There wasn't. Yeah, my understanding is 37th Street was the governor's mansion. I don't know any reason not to believe that, so.
Anybody know anything about that building downtown? As far as the 10th and Mulberry, were they building cars in there?
Oh,
Big building, I mean,
you mean on the Look building?
well, that,
See, there are two buildings, and I never understood this either. But on the west side of 10th is a older, the pictures I showed you here.
that looks familiar.
Yeah, that's the older building that is the original Ford Motor Company, 1912, and then 2 more floors, 1914. And that's where they started. And then they built what we've known as the Look building, which is on the east side of 10th Street. And that's a big building now, it's full of condos, I guess. That used to be the Herring Motor Company assembly area. And then they also assembled, I guess, at 18th and Grand. I mean, I
Wondered how it worked with 18th and Grand. They started out in a smaller place and went over west. But
my supposition is that they brought everything in from, I guess, Detroit to assemble to 18th and Grand, because that's where the railroad cars went. They did it there, and then they probably used the Look building for, you know, finer point assembly, or maybe working on cars and stuff like
they
that.
have a showroom there?
Yeah, I saw pictures of a showroom there
Did they
too.
sell cars out of the retail, or was it just?
I think so, and in fact, yeah, we have a book here that I have not seen, but Mike got it off of eBay, and it shows, thank you very much, Mary. It shows pictures of the Herring Motor Company in the interior and everything, and it looks like they used it as a sales room as well as business office and plant participations. Well, I'll put this over here because it's for everyone to look at. And that Heroline can is, there's a bunch of people who collect oil and gas cans. And so I go to these shows every now and then, and that one is one that I found. It's the Heroline oil can from the Herring Motor Company when they were doing oil and all of that sort of thing. Well, thank you for adding to my stories, and now I'm going to have to write it all down because it's very interesting. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Right.